The notice Virginia Ramsey pinned to the post outside Larkspur Creek's general store read plain and shameless for all the town to see. Seeking husband, willing to work. Payment offered in 1 milk cow and 1 gold ring, silver mounted. Inquire at the Ramsey Place, 2 miles north of the creek. It was the spring of 1878, and Wyoming Territory had already taught Virginia that pride did not put beans in a pot, nor did it keep a roof from leaking. And so she stood there with her jaw set and her chin high, while old Mrs. Petty gasped behind the store window loud enough to be heard through the glass. Virginia was 22 years old, with hair the color of wheat before harvest and hands that had gone rough from years of chores. No young lady back east would have recognized as ladylike at all. She had buried her father 3 winters past, taken by a fever that swept through the cattle camps, and her mother long before that, in childbed, when Virginia herself had been too small to remember more than a scent of lavender and a soft voice humming. It had been her grandmother, Eleanor Ramsey, who raised her after. Out on the homestead claim her father had staked along the North Fork of the creek, and it was her grandmother who now lay abed more mornings than not, her lungs rattling like dry corn husks in a wind. The land itself was good, or would have been, if there had been 2 strong hands enough to work it instead of 1 young woman stretched thin trying to be both daughter and son. 60 acres, a soddy that had been meant only as a first shelter before a proper house could be raised, and water rights on the creek that a man named Silas Crocker wanted more than he wanted his own soul, or so it seemed to Virginia, watching him ride past her fence line nearly every week with that same greedy squint in his eye. Crocker owned the biggest spread for 30 miles and half the paper on half the homesteads besides. He had come to call the week before, hat in hand and voice syrup-sweet, offering to buy out the Ramsey claim for a price so low it would have insulted a dog. When Virginia refused, he had smiled in that way that made her stomach turn and said the offer would not stand forever, and neither, perhaps, would a young widow woman's claim, once folks in the territory office got to asking who exactly was working that land and how. It was true enough to frighten her. The Homestead Act required a claimant to prove up the land, to show improvement and residence. And while Wyoming Territory had granted women rights no other territory dared give, including the vote just 8 years past, there were still men who whispered that a woman alone could not hold ground the way a man could, and men like Crocker who meant to prove it by any means available to them. Virginia had turned the problem over in her mind through long nights of mending by lamplight, and had come, at last, to a solution so plain it embarrassed her to say it aloud. She needed a husband, not for her heart's sake, though she was young enough still to want that too, somewhere down deep where she did not often look, but for the plain fact that 2 hands would keep the claim proved and the wolves, both 4-legged and Crocker-shaped, from the door. The trouble was that Virginia Ramsey had no dowry to speak of. She had a milk cow named Buttercup, gentle and reliable, who gave sweet cream enough to trade for flour and coffee at the store. And she had her grandmother's ring, a thin gold band set with a small garnet stone, brought over from Ireland 2 generations back and kept wrapped in a handkerchief in the bottom of a trunk, the one thing of real value the family had left. "You cannot mean to give away my ring," Eleanor had said when Virginia told her the plan, propped up on pillows with her gray hair loose about her shoulders. "That ring is all that is left of your grandfather, of where we came from. I mean to give it as payment, grandmother, not to lose it. A man who takes it in good faith to marry me will see it returned to our family soon enough, once we've proved the claim and paid down what we owe. I would rather part with it a little while than lose the land entire and have nothing left to put a ring on at all." Eleanor had studied her for a long moment, and something like pride and sorrow both moved behind her tired eyes. "You have your mother's stubbornness," she said finally. "God help whatever man answers that notice." The first man to answer was Otis Fenwick, a widower of some 50 years with 3 grown sons and a smell of whiskey that arrived before he did. He looked Virginia over like she was a horse he was thinking of buying, then looked over Buttercup with rather more interest, and aloud as how he supposed a wife came along easier if there was a good milker thrown in. "I'm not selling the cow separate from myself, Mr. Fenwick," Virginia told him, arms crossed. "The bargain is a husband who will work this land and treat me and my grandmother with respect. If that is not your intention, I will thank you to ride on." He rode on, grumbling about women getting notions. The second man was younger, a store clerk from town named Hiram Slade, who fancied himself something of a catch on account of his position behind the counter at Whitcomb's Dry Goods. He came calling with his hair slicked down with pomade and a poem he had copied from a magazine, and when Virginia asked him plainly whether he knew how to mend fence or plow a furrow, he admitted he did not, but supposed he could learn given time. "I do not have time, Mr. Slade," Virginia said, not unkindly, for he seemed a decent enough soul, only poorly suited. "The planting is upon us and my grandmother is ill. I need a husband who already knows the work, not one who intends to learn it at my expense." Reverend Whitfield, who had posted the notice for her at the church door as well, out of a mixture of pity and genuine concern for the Ramsey women's welfare, came by on the third day to ask how the search progressed, and found Virginia sitting on the porch step with her face in her hands, more discouraged than she had let herself be in front of anyone else. "There is no shame in it, Virginia," the Reverend said, settling his considerable bulk onto the step beside her. "Marriages of convenience are as old as this territory itself. Half the wives in Larkspur Creek came out here on a promise and a train ticket, sight unseen. You are only doing plain what most do dressed up in prettier words." "It is not the shame of it, Reverend. It is that every man who comes seems to want either the cow or nothing at all, and none of them seem to want the work of it. I begin to think there is no honest man left in this territory who is not already married." "There is one more you have not tried," the Reverend said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, as though weighing whether to speak at all. "A drover come through with the Elkhorn herd last week, stayed on to do fence work for Tom Bellamy while the rest of the outfit moved on north. Name of Noah Graves. Quiet fellow. Bellamy says he is the hardest worker he has had in 10 years and honest to a fault, will not even take a meal he has not earned by his own reckoning. He has no family that anyone knows of, no claim of his own, seems to be drifting since the war took something out of him, though he never says what." Virginia looked up. "Is he a drinking man? A gambling man?" "Neither, so far as Bellamy has seen, and Bellamy would know, for the man boards in his bunkhouse. If you want my honest opinion, Virginia, and you may take it or leave it as you please, I think Noah Graves is exactly the sort of man your notice was meant to find, if only he can be persuaded to answer it. He does not strike me as a man who reads notices posted outside the general store. He strikes me as a man trying very hard not to be noticed at all." That afternoon, against her better judgment, and moved by nothing more than the Reverend's steady confidence, Virginia hitched the old wagon, put Buttercup's lead rope in the back should proof of the bargain be needed, and drove the 2 miles into town and out the other side to the Bellamy spread, her heart beating harder than the errand seemed to warrant. She found him mending a section of fence along the north pasture, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat darkening the back of his shirt despite the cool spring air. He was tall, broad through the shoulder in the way of men who had done hard labor since boyhood, with dark hair curling damp at his collar, and a face that might have been called handsome if it were not so guarded, the kind of face that had learned early to give nothing away. When he heard the wagon and turned, his eyes were a pale gray-blue, striking against sun-browned skin, and they studied her with a wariness that made Virginia wonder just what Reverend Whitfield had meant about something the war had taken out of him. "Afternoon," he said, setting down his hammer but not otherwise moving to greet her. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" "I am told you might be looking for steady work," Virginia said, and immediately regretted how blunt it sounded, standing there in the wagon with her hands twisted in her lap. She made herself climb down, made herself stand square in front of him the way she had with Fenwick and Slade, though her stomach turned over twice as hard this time for reasons she could not entirely name. I have steady work with Bellamy, through the summer at least. I am not offering work exactly. I am offering marriage. She saw something flicker in his face, surprise breaking through the guarded stillness for just a moment, and she pressed on before he could refuse outright. I have a homestead claim 2 miles north of the creek, 60 acres proved but not enough to keep against a man who wants my water rights and does not much care how he gets them. I need a husband who can work that land honest and hard, and defend it if it comes to that. I cannot pay wages. What I can offer is my milk cow, a fine gentle animal who gives good cream, and my grandmother's ring, gold with a garnet stone, worth more than either of us likely have seen in one place at one time. I know it is a strange offer to make a stranger. I have made it twice before this week and been refused both times, though for different reasons than I expect you would give. Noah Graves stood very still through all of this, his hammer hanging forgotten from one hand, and when she finished he did not laugh, which she had half expected, nor did he look at her the way Fenwick had looked at the cow. He looked instead like a man doing sums in his head, weighing something far heavier than a cow and a ring. "You would marry a man you know nothing about," he said slowly, "for the sake of keeping a claim." "I would marry a man I know nothing about because I have run out of other choices, Mr. Graves, and because Reverend Whitfield speaks well of you, and because you have not yet told me no." She lifted her chin, daring him to see the fear underneath the boldness, though she hoped he could not. "My grandmother is unwell. I love that land because my father died proving it, and because it is the only thing standing between us and nothing at all. I will not pretend this is a romance, but I will promise you honest treatment, a warm house, and a fair share in whatever that land yields, so long as you work it beside me and not against me." For a long moment the only sound was the wind moving through the new grass and a meadowlark somewhere off toward the creek, and Noah Graves looked at her the way a man looks at a fork in a road he had not expected to reach so soon. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Virginia Ramsey, Noah Graves." He said it plain, as though introducing himself for the first time to a task rather than a woman, and something in the careful formality of it made her want, unaccountably, to laugh. "I will need to speak with Bellamy about ending my work early, and I would want to see this land before I gave you an answer, Miss Ramsey. A man ought to know what he is signing his name to." "That seems only fair," Virginia said, and did not let herself smile, though it took some effort. He rode out to see the homestead 2 days later, on a borrowed horse, hat pulled low against a sky-threatening rain, and Virginia watched from the porch as he walked the fence line slow and careful, checked the well, looked over the sod house with an assessing eye that missed nothing, the sagging roof beam, the good chimney draft, the fertile black soil turned up along the garden rows where Virginia had already put in early peas and onions. He spent near an hour at it while Virginia's stomach knotted tighter with each passing minute, and when he came back to the porch he had removed his hat, which she would come to learn was a habit of his whenever he meant to speak something serious. "It is good land," he said, "better than most I have seen this side of the territory line. Whoever put in that garden knew what they were doing." "That was me," Virginia said, unable to keep a small note of pride from her voice. "Then you will not need much teaching in that regard." He turned the hat over once in his hands, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with his otherwise steady manner. "I lost a claim once, Miss Ramsey, in Kansas before the war ended me up out here. My brother and I filed together, and when he did not come home from Shiloh, I could not hold it alone against a bank that wanted the note called due. I have not tried to put down roots since, because I did not much see the point of growing attached to ground a man could lose in a season's bad luck. But I find I do not like the notion of that happening to you, either, if it can be helped." He looked up, and his gray eyes held her steady in a way that made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. "I will marry you, Miss Ramsey, and I will work this land honest, and I will do what I can to see that Crocker or any man like him does not take it from you. I do not ask for the cow or the ring as payment. If you would rather keep them, I would understand it." "No," Virginia said, and found her voice thicker than she meant it. "A bargain is a bargain, Mr. Graves. It would not sit right with me otherwise. Besides," and here she managed a small smile, "Buttercup will need someone to milk her of a morning besides me, if I am to keep this claim proved and this house running both." He almost smiled back, she thought, though it did not quite make it all the way to his mouth. "Then I suppose I had best learn where you keep the pail." They were married the following Sunday, in the small clapboard church in Larkspur Creek, with Reverend Whitfield presiding and Alina Ramsey sitting in the front pew, wrapped in her good shawl despite the mild weather, her face pale but her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. There were few witnesses beyond Tom Bellamy, come to see off the best hand he had lost to matrimony, and Mrs. Petty from the general store, who could not resist seeing for herself how the strange bargain would play out, and who cried a little during the vows despite herself, being a sentimental woman underneath her sharp tongue. Virginia wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the hem, blue calico faded soft with years but clean and pressed, and when Noah Graves slipped the plain gold band she had bought with her last silver dollar onto her finger, his hands were steadier than her own, though she noticed, when he lifted his eyes to hers, that there was something there that had not been in his face 2 days before on Bellamy's fence line, something that looked almost like wonder, quickly hidden away again behind his careful stillness. Alina's ring, the garnet band that had started the whole affair, stayed wrapped in its handkerchief in the trunk, for Noah had insisted, quietly and firmly, that he would take no payment beyond what the marriage itself gave him, which was a home and a purpose he had not had in longer than he cared to admit. Virginia had argued the point once gently, and let it drop when she saw how much it seemed to matter to him. The first weeks of marriage were awkward in the particular way of two strangers learning to share a small space and a large burden. Noah slept in the Linta shed at first, though Virginia had offered him the second room, insisting it was proper for a husband and wife to share a house until they knew each other better, and Virginia found herself oddly moved by his consideration, even as it made the nights feel emptier than she had expected. He rose before dawn each morning and was already at the fence or the plow by the time Virginia came out to milk Buttercup, and more than once she found he had already done the milking himself, the pail sitting full and warm by the door, before he moved on to whatever heavier task the day required. He mended the sod roof so it no longer leaked, dug a second well when the first ran low in the dry weeks of June, and built, board by careful board scavenged and bought on credit against the harvest to come, the beginnings of a proper frame house to replace the soddy, working by lantern light after supper until Virginia scolded him to rest. "You will wear yourself to nothing," she told him one such evening, bringing out a cup of coffee to where he sat on an overturned crate, planing a board smooth by lantern light, his shirt dark with sweat despite the cool night air. "I have been idle too long, Virginia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal miss attached, a small thing that nonetheless made warmth spread through her chest. "It feels good to work ground that is not going to be taken out from under me by a bank's whim. I had forgotten what that felt like." "It might yet be taken, if Crocker has his way," she said, sitting on the step near him, drawing her shawl close. "It will not," Noah said, and there was a quiet certainty in it that she found herself believing despite every hard lesson life had taught her about certainty and how little the world cared for it. "I did not save one claim, Virginia. I mean to save this one, or die trying, which I do not intend to do either, so we may as well settle in for a long fight if it comes to that." She laughed, surprised by it, and he looked up at the sound with something soft moving behind his careful eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything more, only sat together in the lantern light while the crickets sang in the grass and Buttercup shifted in her stall nearby. And Virginia thought, not for the first time, that perhaps this bargain had given her more than a fence mender and a field hand after all. Eleanor took to Noah faster than Virginia had dared hope. He carried water for the old woman without being asked, sat with her of an evening while Virginia finished the mending, and listened, genuinely listened, when Eleanor told her long stories of Ireland and the crossing and the husband she had buried on the Kansas plains before ever reaching Wyoming Territory at all. "He has a good heart, that one," Eleanor told Virginia one evening, when Noah had gone out to check the stock before turning in. "I know a bargain is a bargain, child, but do not let it stay only that. I have watched the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is looking. That is not the look of a man only fulfilling a contract." "Grandmother, please," Virginia said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. "I am old, not blind. Mark me on this." Virginia marked her, though she said nothing more of it, and found herself watching Noah with new attention in the weeks that followed, noticing things she had perhaps noticed before without letting herself dwell on them. The way he always let her precede him through a doorway. The care he took in learning which chores she preferred and which she found tedious, quietly taking on the tedious ones without comment. The gentleness in his big rough hands when he helped deliver a breech calf from one of Bellamy's cows, called over in an emergency, work that left him bloodied to the elbow but the calf breathing and the mother cow recovering within the day. It was Silas Crocker who first put a name, however unkindly, to what was growing between them. He rode out to the Ramsey claim on a hot afternoon in July, trailed by two of his hired men, and found Virginia hanging wash while Noah worked at raising the frame of the new house, its skeleton of timber rising against the blue sky like the promise of something permanent. "Mrs. Graves," Crocker said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy, using her married name as though it amused him. "I see you have found yourself a husband after all. I confess I did not think that particular scheme of yours would come to anything." "You are on my land, Mr. Crocker," Virginia said, not pausing in her work though her heart had picked up its pace. "I did not invite you to call. I came to renew my offer." "Circumstances have not changed the value of this water, Mrs. Graves, only added a mouth to feed off it." He glanced toward Noah, who had come down off the timber frame and was crossing the yard with slow, deliberate steps, a hammer still in one hand though he made no threatening move with it. "Your husband is a drifter with no name in this territory and no claim of his own before this one, so I am told. Men like that do not stay put, in my experience. When he moves on, as such men do, you will be alone again, and my offer will not be so generous." "I have no intention of moving on," Noah said, coming to stand beside Virginia, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and something in the flat calm of his voice made Crocker's smug expression falter, just slightly. "This is my home now, same as it is my wife's. I would ask you to state your business plain, Mr. Crocker, or else get off this land." Crocker's smile thinned. "The creek runs through your claim before it reaches mine, Graves. I mean to have the water rights one way or another, and I would rather buy them fair than see this go the hard way. There is no shame in selling to a man with the means to make it worth your while." "There is no shame in a fair sale, no," Noah agreed. "There would be considerable shame in taking a woman's land from her by threat and calling it business, which is what I hear you are doing. This claim is proved, filed, and legal, Mr. Crocker, same as any claim in this territory, man's or woman's, and I intend to see it stays that way. Good day to you." Crocker studied him a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes, then wheeled his horse without another word and rode off with his men trailing behind, though not before casting one more look back at the two of them standing together in the yard, close as any married couple long accustomed to standing shoulder to shoulder against the world. "He will not let this go," Virginia said quietly once they were alone again. "I have seen him ruin other homesteaders who would not sell. The Delacroix family, 2 years back, had their fences cut and their well fouled until they gave up and moved on. No one could prove it was Crocker's men, but everyone knew. Then we will keep a close watch, Noah said, and I will speak to Reverend Whitfield about who else in the county has had similar trouble. There is strength in numbers, Virginia, and I doubt we are the only ones Crocker has set his sights on. It was the first time he had called her simply Virginia in front of another soul, and though the circumstance was grim, she found herself warmed by it nonetheless, a small ember glowing steady against the chill of Crocker's threat. August brought the first real trouble. Virginia woke one morning to find the north fence torn down in 3 places, and a dozen head of the small cattle herd they had begun building, purchased on credit against the coming harvest, scattered halfway to the county road. Noah spent the whole day rounding them up and mending fence, jaw tight with a fury he kept carefully controlled, though Virginia saw it flash hot in his eyes when he found boot prints in the mud near the torn wire that did not match any of their own. "Crocker's men," he said, crouching to study the print more closely. "I would stake my life on it, though I cannot prove it to a sheriff's satisfaction. What do? We keep watch. I will take first shift tonight and every night after until this settles." He looked up at her, and something in his exhaustion made him less guarded than usual, his voice rough with feeling he did not often let show. "I am sorry, Virginia. I told you I would keep this land safe, and here it is not even 2 months and already trouble at the door." "You have kept it safer than I could have alone," Virginia said, kneeling beside him in the trampled grass, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him despite the coolness of the evening settling in. "I do not blame you for Crocker's greed, Noah. I blame Crocker." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her breath catch, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her, might close the small distance still remaining between them even after weeks of marriage and shared work and quiet evenings on the porch step. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood, offering her a hand up, and the moment passed, though it left something warm lingering in its wake that neither of them spoke of. The watches continued through the rest of August without further incident, though the strain of it showed in the shadows under Noah's eyes, and the way Virginia found herself listening for hoofbeats even in her sleep. It was a leaner, watching them both wear thin with worry and hard work, who suggested what turned out to be the thing that finally shifted the balance between them from cautious partnership into something neither of them could any longer pretend was only convenient arrangement. "There is to be a harvest dance next Saturday in town," Eleanor said one evening, laying down her knitting with the air of a woman who had been planning her words carefully. "I think you should both go. You have not had one evening of pleasure since you married, only work and worry, and a marriage needs some joy in it now and then, or it withers same as any other living thing. Grandmother, we cannot leave you alone, and there is too much. I am not so frail as all that, and Mrs. Petty has already offered to sit with me, since she has been dying of curiosity about the 2 of you since the wedding, and this gives her the excuse to satisfy it properly. Go, Virginia. Wear your mother's dress. Let that husband of yours see you as something other than a partner in fence mending for one evening." Virginia protested twice more and was overruled both times, and so it was that the following Saturday found her standing in front of the small mirror in the new house, which had progressed enough to have walls and a roof if not yet all its furnishings, wearing her mother's blue calico with her hair done up more carefully than she had bothered with in months, feeling a nervousness she found almost silly given that she had already been married to the man for 2 months. Noah, when he came to fetch her for the wagon, stopped in the doorway and said nothing at all for a long moment, and the way he looked at her made the nervousness in her stomach turn into something warmer, something that spread all the way to her fingertips. "You are beautiful, Virginia," he said finally, quietly, as though the words had cost him some effort to release. "I do not believe I have told you that before now, and I should have. You have been rather occupied keeping our cattle from wandering to Nebraska," Virginia said, trying for lightness though her voice came out softer than she intended. "That is no excuse for a man not to tell his wife she is beautiful," Noah said, and offered his arm with a formality that made her want to laugh and cry both at once, and she took it, and they walked out to the wagon together under a sky just beginning to purple with sunset. The dance was held in the largest barn in the county, belonging to a rancher named Holly's who opened it up twice a year for such occasions. The floor swept clean and lanterns strung from the rafters, a fiddle and a guitar providing music lively enough to shake dust from the old beams. Virginia had not danced since before her father died, and she found herself nervous again standing at the edge of the floor while couples spun past, until Noah, without a word, simply held out his hand. "I do not know that I am much of a dancer," he admitted as they took their places among the other couples. "I have not had occasion to practice in some years." "Neither have I," Virginia said. "We shall simply have to be terrible together." They were not terrible, as it turned out, though they were not especially graceful either, and it did not matter in the least, because somewhere in the second song Noah's hand at her waist stopped feeling like the careful, respectful distance of two people bound by contract and started feeling like something else entirely. And when their eyes met she saw in his the same recognition she felt rising in her own chest, warm and a little frightening in its suddenness after weeks of careful restraint. They did not speak of it directly that night, though they danced 3 more times than propriety strictly required, and Virginia noticed, with a small thrill she was not proud of but could not suppress, the way Hiram Slade watched them from across the barn with something like envy on his face, and the way old Mrs. Petty leaned toward Reverend Whitfield to whisper something that made them both smile knowingly in Virginia's direction. It was on the ride home, the wagon rolling easy beneath a sky thick with stars, that Noah finally spoke what had been building between them all evening. "Virginia," he said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him fully. "I agreed to this marriage because you needed a husband and I needed a reason to stop drifting. I told myself it was only that, a fair trade, honest work for a home. But I find that is not the whole truth of it any longer, and I do not think it has been for some weeks now." "What is the whole truth of it, then?" Virginia asked, her voice barely above the sound of the wheels on the dirt road. "The truth is I have come to love you," Noah said, plain and simple as he said everything that mattered to him, though his hands were tight on the reins in a way that betrayed how much the admission cost him. "Not because of any bargain, and not because you are a fine cook, though you are, and not because you keep a garden better than most men I have known. I love you because you stood in front of me on Bellamy's fence line with your chin up and your fear showing plain underneath, and asked a stranger to marry you rather than lose what your father died proving. I have not met courage like that before, Virginia, and I do not intend to let it go now that I have found it." Virginia felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, and she reached over to take his hand from the reins, holding it tight in both of hers. "I did not expect to love you either, Noah. I told myself the same thing, that it was only a fair bargain, a practical arrangement. But I have watched you work this land like it was your own before you had any promise it would stay so, and I have watched you sit with my grandmother of an evening listening to her stories like they mattered to you as much as they matter to her. And somewhere in all that watching I stopped seeing a stranger and started seeing my husband, truly my husband, in every way that matters." He stopped the wagon then, right there on the empty road under the wide Wyoming sky, and turned to her, and this time when their eyes met there was no hesitation left in either of them. He kissed her slow and careful at first, as though asking permission even now, and when she answered by winding her fingers into his hair and pulling him closer, the careful restraint of 2 months dissolved entirely into something fierce and tender both at once, a promise made not before a preacher this time, but between only the two of them and the watching stars. They rode the rest of the way home with her head resting against his shoulder, and that night, for the first time since their wedding, Noah did not retreat to the Lenta shed but stayed in the house proper, in the room that had always been meant for both of them. And Virginia fell asleep with a happiness so full it felt almost like grief for all the lonely months that had come before it. The autumn that followed was the happiest Virginia could remember since her father's death, despite the shadow of Crocker's ambitions still hanging over the claim. The harvest came in better than expected. The new house finished enough to move Eleanor into a proper bedroom with a window that caught the morning sun, and the small cattle herd, watched carefully now with the help of a dog Noah trained up from a Bellamy pup, grew steady and healthy through the fall grazing. Crocker did not come himself again, but his shadow lingered in smaller ways. A note left pinned to the fence renewing his offer with a hint of menace beneath the polite phrasing, a rumor that reached them through Mrs. Petty that Crocker had been asking around the land office about the particulars of the Ramsey claims filing, looking, it seemed, for some technicality he might use to challenge it. "He is looking for a weakness," Noah said one evening, reading the note by lamplight with a frown creasing his brow. "Something to contest the claim on paper, since he has had no luck driving us off by other means." "There is no weakness to find," Virginia said, though a thread of worry ran through her words. "My father proved the claim fair and square. 5 years residence and improvement, filed proper at the land office in Cheyenne." 5 years of residence by your father," Noah said slowly, and Virginia saw the worry sharpen in his eyes as the thought took shape. "But your father died 3 years into that 5, did he not? And the claim passed to you as his heir, a minor at the time, is that not so?" Virginia felt cold move through her despite the warm evening. "I do not know the particulars of how it passed. My grandmother handled all that, while I was still grieving and too young besides to understand the legal workings of it." They went to Eleanor together that same evening, finding her sitting by the window with her Bible open on her lap, and when Virginia asked about the claim's transfer, the old woman's face went carefully still in a way that told Virginia there was indeed something not quite settled about it. "Your father filed the claim in his own name." "Yes," Eleanor said slowly. "When he died, I filed the paperwork to have it transferred to you as his heir, since you had no other living kin to claim it and I myself was too old to file new in my own right. The land office clerk at the time, a Mr. Abernathy, was a kind man and helped me through the process, though I confess I do not know if every paper was filed exactly as it ought to have been. It was a difficult time, Virginia. I was grieving your father same as you and doing my best simply to keep us fed and sheltered. I may have missed some particular of the law in the confusion of it." "Is Mr. Abernathy still at the land office?" Noah asked. "He retired some 2 years back. I do not know who holds his position now." The uncertainty of it sat heavy over the household for the following days, and Noah, restless with worry, finally announced he would ride to Cheyenne himself to review the claims filing and settle the question once and for all before Crocker could use it against them. "I will come with you," Virginia said immediately. "Someone must stay with your grandmother and the harvest is not fully in. I can make the ride faster alone and be back within the week." He took her hands, seeing the protest rising in her face. "Virginia, I promised you I would keep this land safe. Let me do this much of that promise on my own. I will not fail you." She let him go, though it was hard, watching him ride off down the road toward Cheyenne with a satchel of papers and provisions. And the week that followed was the longest of her life since her father's death, filled with worry that gnawed at her even through the ordinary rhythm of harvest chores and caring for Eleanor. He returned on the 6th day, dust-covered and saddle-weary, but with a triumphant light in his eyes that told her the news before he said a word, swinging down from his horse in the yard, and catching her up in his arms the moment she ran out to meet him, spinning her once before setting her down and kissing her thoroughly enough that Eleanor, watching from the window, laughed aloud despite her frailty. "The claim is sound," Noah said, still holding Virginia close. "Mr. Abernathy's successor, a Mr. Coyle, found the original transfer paperwork filed proper and complete, every requirement met to the letter of the law, your grandmother's diligence better than she gave herself credit for. Crocker will find nothing to contest there, whatever he was hoping." "Then it is settled," Virginia breathed, relief flooding through her so strong her knees nearly buckled with it. "Not quite settled," Noah said, and something careful came into his expression now, a nervousness she had not seen in him since the day he first agreed to marry her. "I did one more thing while I was in Cheyenne, Virginia. I hope you will not think it presumptuous." He reached into his satchel and withdrew a small paper, official-looking, and handed it to her with hands that were not quite steady. It was a deed freshly filed, adding his own name alongside hers to the Ramsey claim, so that the land was now held jointly, husband and wife together, exactly as the law of Wyoming Territory, more generous to women than most, allowed. I did not want there to be any question, ever again, of whether this land was truly mine to defend or only something I was borrowing through marriage, Noah said. "I want my name on it beside yours, Virginia, for as long as we both shall live, not because a bargain made it so, but because I choose it freely with my whole heart. If that is not what you want, I will have it changed back." But I could not stop myself from filing it once the thought took hold of me. Virginia found she could not speak past the tightness in her throat, and so she simply threw her arms around him instead, holding on tight enough that he laughed, low and warm against her hair. "It is exactly what I want, Noah Graves. It is everything I want." Crocker's final attempt came in November, after the harvest was fully in and the first frost had silvered the grass along the creek. He arrived not himself this time, but through an agent, a lean man in a black coat who came to serve papers claiming the Ramsey water rights had been improperly allocated under an older territorial statute, a legal maneuver so convoluted that even Reverend Whitfield, consulted for his opinion, admitted he could make little sense of it beyond recognizing it as a delaying tactic meant to force a costly court fight the Ramseys, or Graveses now, could ill afford. But Noah had learned, in his week in Cheyenne, more than just the particulars of their own claim. He had spoken with other homesteaders facing similar pressure, had learned that Crocker's tactics were part of a pattern going back years, contested filings and cut fences and fouled wells visited upon any small claim that stood between Crocker and the water he wanted. Noah had written it all down, careful and thorough, names and dates and the particulars of each complaint, and when the agent came to serve papers, Noah met him at the fence line with that documentation in hand and a calm, steady resolve that seemed to unsettle the agent more than any show of anger could have. "You may tell Mr. Crocker," Noah said, "that I intend to bring this full accounting to the Territorial Land Office and to the newspaper in Cheyenne besides, should he pursue this claim any further. I do not think he will find the attention flattering, given how many other families in this county have similar stories to tell, once they see one family willing to speak up first." The agent left without serving the papers at all, and word came back through Reverend Whitfield some days later that Crocker had quietly withdrawn the contest, unwilling to risk the exposure Noah threatened, and had furthermore sold off a portion of his own water rights downstream to the Delacroix family, and two others he had previously bullied, apparently deciding the trouble of continued conflict outweighed whatever gain he might still wring from it. It was not quite justice, not the full accounting Noah had hoped to bring against a man who had caused so much quiet suffering across the county, but it was enough, a victory hard won and lasting, and Virginia felt something settle in her chest that had been tight with worry since the day of her father's funeral, a sense that the land was truly, finally, safely theirs. That winter was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but it was the first winter in years Virginia faced without the gnawing fear of losing everything, and she found herself, in the quiet evenings by the fire with Noah's arm around her, and Alina dozing in her chair nearby, happier than she had thought possible for a bargain struck out of desperation on a spring afternoon outside the general store. It was on one such evening in early December that Virginia told Noah she was carrying his child, and watched the careful stillness he wore like armor crack entirely, giving way to a joy so unguarded it brought tears to his eyes, the first she had ever seen there. "A child," he said, as though testing the word for truth. "Ours. "Ours," Virginia confirmed, laughing through her own tears as he lifted her carefully off her feet and held her close. And Alina, waking to the commotion, demanded to know what all the fuss was about, and wept happily herself when told, declaring that she intended to live long enough to hold her great-grandchild if it was the last thing she did on this earth. She kept that promise, though it was a near thing. The baby came in August of 1879, a difficult labor that had Noah pacing the yard for the better part of a day, while the midwife from town, Mrs. Delacroix herself, whose family owed the Graves household a debt of gratitude they had not forgotten, worked steadily inside. When the cry finally came, thin and furious and healthy, Noah was inside the house before anyone thought to fetch him, kneeling beside the bed to take his son into his arms with the same careful reverence he had once shown a newborn calf, though this time his eyes were wet and unashamed. They named the boy William, after Virginia's father, and Alina held him within the hour, her face transformed by a joy that seemed to erase decades of hardship from her features, and declared him the finest baby she had seen in her considerable years, a judgment she repeated so often over the following weeks that even Noah, not a man given to teasing, could not resist gently reminding her that she had said the same of Virginia once, and likely of Virginia's mother before that. Alina lived 4 more years past William's birth, long enough to see a second child arrive, a daughter they named Alina Grace after her, and long enough to see the small frame house grow a proper porch and a second story, the herd expand to a size that made the Graves claim one of the more respected small operations in the county, and Crocker himself, humbled by his failed schemes and the quiet censure of neighbors who no longer trusted him, sell off his holdings and move on to try his fortunes elsewhere, leaving Larkspur Creek a gentler place for his absence. She passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn night in 1883, with Virginia holding one hand and Noah the other, and though the grief of it was sharp and real, there was comfort too in knowing she had lived to see her granddaughter safe, loved, and thriving on the land her own son-in-law had died proving, surrounded by a family grown larger and stronger than the desperate bargain of 5 years before could ever have promised. The garnet ring, kept safe in its handkerchief through all those years, finally found its purpose the spring after Alina's passing, when Virginia gave it to her daughter, little Alina Grace, not yet old enough to understand its full weight, but old enough to be told the story of how her great-grandmother had carried it from Ireland, and how her own mother had once offered it as payment for a husband, only to find something far richer than any bargain could promise. "Your father did not want the ring, or the cow either, if truth be told," Virginia told her daughter, years later, when Alina Grace was grown enough to ask about the story that had become something of a legend around Larkspur Creek, the tale of the woman who bargained for a husband with nothing but a milk cow and her grandmother's ring. He wanted only a reason to stop drifting, and a chance to prove he could hold something without losing it. "I think, in the end, we bargained each other into a life neither of us knew we were looking for." Noah, overhearing this from where he sat mending a bridle on the porch, looked up with that same soft warmth still lighting his gray eyes after all the years between them, unchanged in its steadiness, even as silver had crept into his dark hair and lines had gathered at the corners of his eyes from years of sun and laughter both. "Your mother makes it sound simpler than it was," he said. "There was considerable arguing about who ought to milk the cow of a morning, as I recall, and at least one occasion where she threw a wet dish rag at my head for tracking mud across her clean floor." "I did no such thing," Virginia protested, though she was laughing. "You did, and I deserved it, and I loved you a great deal more for the fire in you than I would have loved a woman who simply let me track mud wherever I pleased." He set aside the bridle and crossed to where she stood, still handsome to her eyes despite the years, still the same steady man who had stood on Bellamy's fence line doing sums in his head about whether to trust a stranger's desperate bargain. "Best trade I ever made in my life, Virginia Graves. A milk cow, a ring I never even took, and a woman with more courage than sense, offered up plain outside a general store to any fool willing to notice her. I have thanked God for that notice every single day since. Buttercup herself, long past her milking years by then, grazed contentedly in the near pasture. Having lived out a full and comfortable life on the land she had never actually been traded away from, her many calves having become the foundation of the herd that now supported 3 generations of the Graves family. William, 17 and already showing his father's steady hands with cattle and his mother's stubborn courage besides, worked the north fence line that his father had first mended as a stranger hired for a bargain he had not expected to keep his whole heart for. Eleanor Grace, 13 and quick with her needle same as her great-grandmother before her, sat on the porch step turning the garnet ring over in her fingers, already dreaming, as young girls do, of the day it might sit upon her own hand. And Virginia Ramsey Graves, standing in the golden light of a Wyoming evening with her husband's arm around her waist and her children's laughter carrying across land that had nearly been lost a dozen times over before finally, truly, becoming home, thought that whatever desperate courage had driven her to post that notice outside the general store all those years ago, it had been the truest bargain of her life, one that had asked for nothing but a milk cow and a ring, and given back in return everything a heart could ever hope to hold. The sun set slow and red beyond the fence lines Noah had built with his own hands, gilding the new house, the thriving herd, the garden rose Virginia still tended each spring same as she always had, and somewhere in the gathering dusk a meadowlark sang the same song it had sung on the day a wary drifter first looked up from his hammer to find a determined young woman standing before him, with an offer no sensible man should have accepted, and every reason in the world to be glad. All these years later that he had,